Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, our next guest calls it the most powerful technology company that China has ever built. No, we're not talking about ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok. It's the app that's has a future that's up in the air. We're not talking about Tencent, which last week was blacklisted by the Biden administration for alleged links to the Chinese military. No, we're not talking about Alibaba or JD.com or Meituan. We're talking about Huawei, the privately held maker of telecom equipment that really, I think, came into focus for a lot of people a few years ago, back in 2018, when the company's CFO, Meng Wanzhou, was arrested in Canada and set off an unprecedented diplomatic uproar. We've got with us the person who wrote the book on Huawei. Eva Dou is technology policy reporter at the Washington Post and the author of the new book out today, House of Huawei, The Secret History of China's Most Powerful Company. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Eva, welcome. Congratulations on the book. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about Huawei in just a minute, but you also write a lot about TikTok, U.S.-China technology, security. You've been very busy, so we wanted to pick your brain a little bit about the latest in that realm. Let's start with TikTok, because the fate of this app is up in the air. What do you see as the probable future for TikTok?
Well, the Supreme Court is supposed to be ruling very soon, probably this week. And many people think that the Supreme Court will be upholding the ban on TikTok, and that would mean its only hope for being saved is probably going to be President Trump's administration doing something to make this app continue to be operational in the United States.
What could the Trump administration do to save it?
Well, under the law, TikTok could continue to operate if it is sold to other ownership. This is, of course, something that the company and Beijing are strongly resistant to. So it probably would involve diplomatic negotiations between the Trump administration and the company and Beijing to convince them to do that.
Is it likely, though, if that's the case, and I think about the powerful algorithm, does that go with it, or is it a very different TikTok that would end up in the hands of a different owner?
Well, those are some of the questions that are on there. So there's a lot of moving pieces here in the incoming Trump administration's plans for China, including tariffs, including a really tough policy on trade. And so TikTok is going to be part of it. And so it really depends how they prioritize it and how they negotiate it.
I feel like this transitions well into your new book out. And what I want to ask is the outcome of what happens with TikTok. Does that indicate to you a very serious and significant change in U.S.-China relations and really the global business environment and global tech environment? Or is that TikTok or a Huawei, which we're going to start talking about, are they separate? Are they individual cases?
Well, certainly. I think both of them are part of the same trend of just heightened security awareness about technology and it becoming a priority. An app like TikTok just a few years ago, the idea that it would be banned in the United States was viewed as ludicrous. There was much more space for technology that was seen as consumer technology. And there's been, the line in the sand has really moved very rapidly to where security concerns are taking precedence. And both with an app like TikTok and with the telecommunications equipment that Huawei makes, there is this growing understanding among policymakers that just enormous amounts of data flow through these systems, and that that the security angle is now taking precedence.
Well, Eva, and I want to also then ask maybe about the flip side of U.S. in terms of our own tech giants. But I think it is fair to say the assumption that it's maybe different for a Chinese tech giant. Can we assume that a company like Huawei, I mean, your new book out is The House of Huawei, The Secret History of China's Most Powerful Company. I mean, for a company to become as giant and successful as Huawei, should we assume that there is some Chinese involvement, some Chinese oversight, some understanding among Huawei and the access that the Chinese government can and will probably have to that company or their information or their abilities?
Well, this is really the question that has been debated by policymakers around the world and key to whether they keep Huawei in their systems or not. And so I think one thing to remember is that the companies are not necessarily in control. They can't necessarily say for sure if someone is accessing their systems or not. Certainly, the equipment being developed in a certain country would mean there's an elevated risk of it being accessed by intelligence agencies, whether in the development process or in the shipment process. And sometimes that happens even without the company's knowledge.
Oh, interesting.
So that is, yeah. So security experts do say that is a legitimate risk and something where it's very hard to sort of find smoking guns. So what policymakers have been saying is sort of, we're not necessarily saying there's a smoking gun, but there's a, and so it's a preventative measure.
So let's just take a big step back here and talk a little bit about what Huawei does and what Huawei is, because I think, like I said, a lot of people, it wasn't really on their radar until this arrest back in 2018 and the extradition process that was really that took years. Yes, there were some consumer devices in the United States available in the U.S. They didn't really take off. What do people need to understand about what Huawei makes and where they are able to sell it?
I think to many people, where they've heard of Huawei is from their smartphones, which for years it's been one of the largest smartphone brands in the world. But really, the reason it's become such a policy concern is it's also the largest maker of the equipment that goes into phone and internet networks around the world. And of course, these networks, they carry all sorts of information, phone calls, emails, internet traffic. And from that perspective, it's become something that policymakers have become very concerned about, is this one company and its global footprint. It's far head and shoulders the dominant supplier in developing nations around the world, and even in Europe is a dominant supplier in many countries.
One thing we wanted to ask you, we've spent a lot of time over the last few years talking with Andy Purdy, who was the chief security officer for Huawei America.
He would come in every few months.
Yeah, and we would talk to him about kind of the strained or growing strained relationships, certainly in the tech environment between the U.S. and China.
He was adamant about Huawei not being a security risk to the United States.
Right, exactly. And so I am wondering, in this environment, access to an administration. You've got Elon Musk, a certainly high-profile member of the tech community. I mean, what are your expectations of Huawei having a strong communication line with the incoming Trump administration, and maybe its future changing in a more favorable way here when it comes to the United States?
Well, I think if that happens, that they make this kind of rebound in communications in the United States, that would be defying expectations. In that the incoming Trump administration, if you look at who is in Trump's team, there's a lot of security hawks. A lot of people have been vocal critics of China for many years. And so I think what we can expect is for policy to be, even more stringent than it has been in recent years as far as control of technology being transferred to China. Um, and from that point of view, I would say it's hard to see where the bright spot is for Huawei in the US market in the foreseeable future.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so I have a few questions around this. One of them being the opportunity for Huawei outside of the US, because we've talked a lot in the past few years about China's growing influence with the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'm wondering, from a cybersecurity perspective, from a telecom infrastructure perspective, are they able to use that as a lever in any way?
Well, I think so. And part of that is just there have been so few alternatives in this market. There's very few players. And so the question is, if you don't use Huawei, what do you use for these developing countries? And so that's sort of been what officials in many of these countries have been saying, which is, the United States wants us to take Huawei equipment out, but what do we do then? Sort of the only comparable vendors for the most part have been European companies whose equipment is far more expensive, and that's just outside of the budget for many countries to do. So part of the US policy under the Biden administration has been to programs to develop new competitors making this kind of gear so that countries do have an alternative if they actually want to switch.
Hey, one more question on the administration, because Carol mentioned Elon Musk being tech friendly and being in the part of the administration in a certain capacity. When you mention China hawks, Elon's not one of those. He has a business in China. He has Tesla there, and he was able to do something that nobody else has been able to do in the past by building his own Tesla facility that doesn't have a joint venture with a Chinese automaker.
And doing it really quickly.
That had never been done. What is his influence in your view when it comes to tech policy in China?
Well, yeah. So Elon Musk is very interesting from this perspective. He's both because he has business interests on both sides. As you mentioned, Tesla, China is a huge market for them and also a production base. And at the same time, for SpaceX, very much they're a U.S. military supplier, and so very much sort of building up, seeing their customer base being very skeptical about China. So I think specific to Huawei, actually, Elon Musk is a direct competitor, though it's not often thought of that way. His Starlink satellite system, it provides an alternative for many countries to using these terrestrial phone and internet networks that Huawei and other companies build. So, and Starlink has been expanding at an extraordinarily rapid rate around the world. We'll probably see more of that competitive dynamic between the companies in coming years.
We're talking with Eva Dou. She's technology policy reporter at the Washington Post. She's the author of the new book out today, House of Huawei, The Secret History of China's Most Powerful Company. Eva, I am curious, you really get into the details of the history of this company that I think most people didn't even think about until we had the problems and the issues, right, of a few years ago. Why is it important to understand the history of this company in light of the security considerations that many global leaders are concerned about when it comes to this company? Tie it up for me.
Yeah, I think part of it is just understanding how we got to this point where the US and China are so acrimonious and there's so much distrust, especially regarding the technology industry now. And so I think Huawei is such a good case study in that it was one of the very first private tech companies founded in China in the early 1800s. And it's been on the front waves of these changing sentiments, China's globalization, that heady period where China was very much embraced by the world, and these tech companies were embraced by the world, and moving towards, this current moment when, the fear that China is a real rival and adversary, capable adversary to the United States, is so on the forefront of policy decision making today.
Oh, okay. So bring us to 2018 when the company's CFO, Meng Wanzhou, was arrested in Canada. It set off that unprecedented diplomatic uproar. She was held for years as this played out in the courts. What happened there?
Yeah, so that was the moment when the rubber kind of hit the road. So for years, there have been these concerns bubbling up in the United States and other Western countries about Huawei. But it really was that moment when the CFO was detained. And at the same point, the Trump administration put these sort of unprecedented sanctions on Huawei that sort of moved us to a new sort of Cold War-esque era where it was clear, like, this era of globalization has come to an end. Now we're into something new, and as far as just seeing China as a competitive rival in a very different way and reacting in a very, very different way.
In a sense, it's a big part of the story is about the shift in China over the years that Huawei has existed. Listen, you did a ton of research on this, interviews, archival research. You have reported from China. You've reported from Taiwan during your career. Can you answer the question for us whether or not Huawei is a security risk to the United States?
A security risk? I would say probably, and that's something that's outside strictly the company's control, and that what we've seen, I think the clearest evidence we've seen has come out in Edward Snowden's leaks, which is that tech companies' equipment can be used by and is used by intelligence agencies who find backdoors or build backdoors into them, even without the company's knowledge. So in a way, it's not entirely in Huawei's executives' hands. They can say, our equipment is safe, we're doing everything that we can, but it's not entirely the company's control.
So I am curious, just for size and scope, something we're very into, certainly here at Bloomberg, what are the capabilities? I mean, how should we be thinking about them in terms of Huawei surveillance systems, which are used by governments all over?
Yeah. So this has very much become something that's like a new business line, these sort of citywide surveillance systems that has to do with, data networks becoming fast enough that you can transmit huge amounts of data. So you can have video cameras and other sorts of sensors all across the city that are just streaming all sorts of information in. So there's a number of governments around the world that are using these systems from Huawei. And it's very controversial. Huawei's not the only company that supplies them. IBM was actually, the US company was actually the first company that started supplying these kinds of systems. But yeah, it's very much a ongoing debate about just how much data governments should be collecting and to what degree citizens have privacy or not.
We're speaking with Eva Dou, technology policy reporter at the Washington Post, also the author of the new book out today, House of Huawei, The Secret History of China's Most Powerful Company.
Tim and I, we spend a lot of time, I'm sure you do too, as we know, talking about large language models, generative AI, what's next in terms of the impact, continuing to track. So I think about what you are saying, what you have learned in the context of Huawei, their role, whether it's 5G in terms of communications or AI technologies. The AI race is on. We know that. So I'm just wondering, how are you thinking about that next chapter and the concerns that we should have considering Huawei's dominance?
Yeah, so Huawei is going to continue to be in the conversation for this AI era. So they are China's most advanced company for designing these chips that drive these AI systems, and so China has been importing huge amounts of U.S. chips for years to build, their big data centers, for large language models. And U.S. sanctions have really been tightened in the past couple of years, which means they're more reliant on Huawei chips than ever before.
Do you think are they being hurt by these restrictions and maybe not having access? And, we continue to see headlines about what this means for NVIDIA and being able to share, its higher end technology. I mean, is Huawei being hurt as a result of all of this? Or does it just make them double down from what you have learned? Does it just make China and Huawei double down to make sure that they have the best and greatest?
Well, certainly they've very much been hurt in that if you look at their trajectory before these sanctions began, they were growing year after year at an enormous clip. And now that growth has stopped. I think the question during the first Trump administration was, can they survive? And so the answer to that is clear now that, they're too important to China, that China is not going to let this company die. It's going to do everything possible for it to survive. That being said, yeah, they've very much been sort of hurt and slowed down by these growing restrictions from the United States.
It's interesting too because it's not a publicly held company; it's a privately held company. Ownership structure. What is it? Who owns it? And does it remain a private company for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, so it's privately held, but with the shares dispersed among numerous current and former Huawei employees. And that for years has been a major part of the incentive program of how Huawei's founder, Ren Fei, got engineers to work incredibly hard towards this cause, which was part of their compensation, was in the dividends they would receive from the company's performance. Since it's privately owned, that means it does not have much of the scrutiny of a publicly owned company. There's definitely limitations of what they have to disclose to the public, and they also aren't at the whims of the stock market. And so that's been actually part of their success in that they've been able to execute really long-term plans and sort of long-term expensive investments that, short-term investors would not necessarily be on board with. And so at this point, it's hard to see why Huawei would go public. They have plenty of funding. China's state policy banks are very supportive when they need funding for their projects. And so it's probably going to remain private for the foreseeable future.
I think about consumers, people who are listening. I mean, when the Bloomberg audience, right? There's obviously investors, there's consumers, and they continue to look at their goods and their security breaches and so on and so forth, especially when it comes to telecom. The consumer base, they need to be concerned, right? And I assume you're going to say they want their governments to make sure that they're overseeing global technology because this is the new world order. And to be fair, can we say that U.S. companies, obviously I would assume the U.S. government is not involved in those technologies. It's not apples to apples. It's different, right? When it's China and the Chinese government when it comes to some of their big companies, particularly tech companies.
Yeah, I think so. One thing is just that technology systems are hacked all the time and probably hacked more than the average consumer would realize. And so to a certain extent, it is just what is your risk level? If you work for the government, if you work for, certain sensitive industries, yeah, you probably want to think twice about exactly what kind of equipment you're using. And in fact, your employer probably has already guidelines in place. For the average consumer, there is a certain risk that your data could be hacked, but that probably existed whether you knew it or not.
Eva, just one last question. Got about a minute and a half here. What was the most revealing thing to you in writing this book, doing the deep dive, going into the archive, talking to so many different voices? What was, again, the most revealing thing in this process for you?
I think one of the most fun parts for me was just seeing all the places and all the historical moments where Huawei popped up while I was sort of researching in archives in the US and China and around the world. And it really gave me an appreciation of companies like this, just how plugged in, how they are affected and how they affect events going on around the globe. In China, for the historic Hong Kong handover, when Hong Kong was returned from being a British colony to China, Huawei was there and helping to do the video surveillance for it. For the Arab Spring, the Iraq War, Huawei was on the ground. So they're far more than a consumer company. When you supply the phone and internet networks, those are crucial. And the first thing that you're expected to be first on the ground when anything big is happening.
Listen, great stuff, and so glad we got so much time. Eva Dou, she's technology policy reporter at Washington Post. Her new book, House of Huawei.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek, insight from the reporters and editors that bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Businessweek. That is Carol Massar. I'm Tim Stenovec. Carol, we learned yesterday that U.S. consumers said they will see higher inflation over the next few years than previously thought. This came from a monthly Federal Reserve Bank of New York survey. It showed that it's the latest sign of mounting concerns about prices coming after November's elections.
Yeah, that's likely not a surprise to Katie Thomas. She's lead at the Kearney Consumer Institute. It's the company that studies consumers and their behavior to understand the current business and economic environment. We know sentiment can be, certainly consumer sentiment, so powerful. She usually joins us from Pittsburgh, which is here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. Really nice to have you in studio. How are you?
I'm great. It's great to be here. It makes it feel much more exciting being here live.
We are fun in studio.
Yeah.
If we may say so ourselves.
Exactly. Pat on the back, on the back. Hey, how's the consumer doing?
The consumer is in an interesting place right now because ultimately we're still hearing a lot of voiced stress about everyday purchases such as grocery, but in reality we all know they're still spending, right? The question I keep asking is, why are we so concerned about groceries when malls and airports are more crowded than they've ever been? Okay,
I'm really glad you brought that up because I was digging through your website, the report that you have out about the power of the consumer and keeping up with the consumer. Watch what people do, not what they say. And what you guys do is you look at behavior. You don't necessarily look at what people are telling you about their behavior because there's this distinction there.
Yeah, you have to kind of combine the two because perception is reality. So if people are talking about things or voicing stress, you can't completely disregard it. But what we're seeing right now is really a parsing out of the needs versus wants. So for a long time, we've heard the narrative of, people are expending on experiences over things. But I was always questioning that, like what things are losing? Well, actually what we're starting to see is people are willing to save on their everyday items like groceries. You're seeing Aldi, Walmart, those kinds of companies, strong value props report well. People want to spend and optimize their needs so they really can spend on their wants. And so you're starting to see that really shake out in terms of how people are thinking about where they spend.
I guess, I think about, was it Walmart, their last earnings, and even the higher end, I think that's becoming an even important aspect of their business. They're seeing that kind of upscale consumer shopping more and more at Walmart.
Exactly. Consumers want to get the best bang for their buck on their everyday items so that then they can spend it on the things they want to, whether that's luxury, clothes, my Aldi has an Ulta across the street, whatever that may be.
So what does that mean for the way that consumers are making choices? What they're choosing to... You say that the airports are crowded and flights and hotels are expensive, but yet they're also saying that grocery prices are expensive.
Right. So that's kind of that voiced stress. In reality, when you run the numbers, you can see that the percentage of food as compared to wages is basically flat. So we started to run this from 2019 to 2024. The biggest challenge we're seeing is that consumer psychology, which people are stuck on reference prices and anchor prices from 2019.
Well, that's because for many people, Carol, correct me if I'm wrong, but we never experienced inflation as adults.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you. That I think our perspective was like, well, this was the norm. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, what is this? Why am I don't know. Why have things, it just feels so unusual and it feels like it's very out of whack.
Exactly, but it is from a historical perspective, but not from a math perspective in terms of someone's budget. And the good thing was a rising tide lifted all ships. When wages lifted, it wasn't just white collar; it was across the board. And so people still feel the strain, and the price increases are real, of course.
Yeah,
but they can't afford
because the prices haven't come down, right? We keep stressing this, right? The pace of inflation, of prices going up, has come down. But it's not like all of a sudden we're seeing decreasing pricing.
Right. And that's why you're seeing people want to optimize in their high frequency everyday items. That's why you're seeing a lot of the retailers with strong value prop in grocery and some of those core categories, even apparel, do well.
So let me ask you, Katie, so in terms of the consumers or the retail environment, like we just talked about, who were we talking about? Oh, Romain. Like we were talking about you were talking about Signet Jewelers and that he's like, I wouldn't want to be a retailer trying to figure out what the consumer is going to do, when they're going to do it, how they're going to do it. It's really, really tricky. So are there parts of the retail environment that you think, well, you should watch out that, especially as we get into earnings, it could be really difficult for them?
So one of the things that we're talking a lot about in our research is the idea of consumer tensions, and in particular as it relates to the proliferation of choice. So we've seen optionality just go through the roof, and that's part of the reason consumers are really able to optimize their spend is they have all these options in retailers and brands where they can really pick and choose.
And they can also just do it online and type something in and see many different options from companies, and those companies are competing with each other. That's probably why Businessweek back in 2019, and I just looked this up, Carol.
Yeah.
Joel would always remind us of this. Former editor of Bloomberg Businessweek, there was that cover that asked, did capitalism kill inflation? It was a picture of a dinosaur.
Right.
2019, people thought inflation was over.
Yeah.
That was it.
Right. So, that's exactly the challenge we're seeing with consumers. They've really been able to start to figure out where they're going to pick and choose and where they're going to buy. On the brand side, that actually calls into question this ongoing choice, this innovation for innovation's sake, this growth strategies, portfolio strategies. So that's a lot of what we're watching with retailers is who's actually got that relevant choice figured out that's really tapping into what the consumer wants, actually arguably tightening up how much new is on the shelves in favor of having something that because the other thing we are hearing from consumers is I'm totally overwhelmed a lot of times.
Yeah,
I'm analysis paralysis. I get so overwhelmed I don't even buy. I abandon cart. I give up.
All right. So then do you have a clear, I'm thinking about our audience who are listening, right? And thinking about certainly the publicly held retailers that are out there. Who's at risk?
I would say the people at risk are the ones that really, we've talked for a while about death of the middle, the mushy middle. I think that's a little bit of what you're still seeing, which is those mid-tier players that don't seem to quite know what they stand for with the consumer.
The department stores that sometimes struggle, or is it more specialty or what?
Yeah, I think it's more specialty, frankly. I think department stores are navigating, but they have the advantage of being cross-category. So I think when you're a little bit tighter on a category or even a consumer segment, so athleisure, I think, is the sector sector that I would be a little bit wary of. Those can be very like cool brands that kind of rise and fall quickly. Even athletics, same things happening. Those can go in pretty big waves. So those are the kinds of companies I'm watching. Are you really understanding your consumer? Are you innovating too much? Are you optimizing effectively?
What companies are poised to do really well in an environment such as this?
So I think it's, in some cases, it's the ones that are able to merchandise effectively and really give a consumer that curated experience. So one that comes to mind, for instance, is just Trader Joe's. People will tell you they like, and I know that's like a bit of an obvious example, but my argument here is people will say, oh, I like it for the seasonality and my special treats, but really that's a tight merchandise selection. And I think people don't realize the reason they like it is it's easy to shop.
So easy.
Yes.
I agree with you. I get very, very overwhelmed.
Don't go to the ones in New York City while you're here, because that is not easy.
Yeah.
They are lines out the door.
Yeah.
It's true, right?
Lines
they're
out the door.
notorious for nightmarish parking lots, though, all around the country. Like, the parking lots are never big enough.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Well, it'll be fun as we head into earnings season. I mean, the retailers come kind of later on. The consumer, would you say any signs that we're headed towards a recession? In terms of consumer spending, just got about 20 seconds.
Yeah, short answer is no. The biggest thing I'm watching is personal job security. If that gets worse, then I'm worried.
All right, good stuff. Nice to have you in studio. Be well,
Thank you.
well. Happy
Yeah.
2025. Katie Thomas, lead at the Kearney Consumer Institute, joining us here in our studio.